Also, at the top of every broadcast, I like to remind my listening audience of the people and businesses that help support the Bruce Montalvo Show. RenBook.com is one of them, also known as Renaissance Bookshop, and it is owned and operated by my good friend, Chairman of the Riverside County Libertarian Party, Gene Berkman. Now, there was recently a wonderful article in the Press Enterprise covering the bookshop. Again, Renaissance Bookshop is Southern California's premier source for modern liberal and libertarian books. So please be sure to visit Renaissance Bookshop in Riverside, California, one of the first official sponsors of the Bruce Montalvo Show. Now, that's renbook.com. Again, renbook.com. Now, speaking of legendary bookshops and libertarian books, today's guest is personally one of my heroes. I mean, if I would have been alive during the times of Mickey Mantle or Sandy Koufax, today's guest is, to me, is the equivalent of meeting one's baseball hero. Truly, we have hit one out of the park with this broadcast, ladies and gentlemen. My guest on today's program is one of the original documentary filmmakers. He is also the acclaimed author of The Creature from Jekyll Island, a bestseller worldwide, and a riveting critique and analysis of the international bankers and their Ponzi scheme in America known as the Private Federal Reserve, which is the banking arm of the military-industrial complex. Now, the book concentrates on a meeting between the world power elite in 1910 that has since allowed the banksters to take over 99% of the U.S. economy, reaching a critical point of hyperinflation via a monetary system that is based on debt and perpetual war, with no value behind our dollars since Nixon took us off the gold standard in 1971. Now, he has produced what I'm dubbing the most important film in the history of investigative exposés, that being The Capitalist Conspiracy. That is the movie, ladies and gentlemen, the film that woke me up. Ladies and gentlemen, at this time, please welcome my guest on today's show, the legendary filmmaker, G Edward Griffin, to our broadcast. Hello, Ed. Thank you for joining us today.
Well, thank you, Bruce. That's quite an introduction. I'm overwhelmed. Thank you.
I'm overwhelmed to have someone of your magnitude on my show. I mean, it just truly shows that if you put your mind to something, there's nothing you can't achieve, right?
Well, I guess that's true. We learn along the way two lessons, don't we, that seem to be on opposite sides. So one is that you can achieve a lot if you really try, and the other is that sometimes you fail, and then you have to learn why you failed, and then change course.
Right.
But yeah, I like your positive attitude. You know, if at first you don't succeed, the old joke is, don't try skydiving. But on the other hand, you just keep trying until finally you can do skydiving.
Right. Absolutely. Now, Mr. Griffin, let's get right into the interview here. Let's talk about one of your mentors, the author of The Naked Capitalist, Willard Cleon Skousen, a true conservative constitutionalist who, like many libertarians, advocated for the elimination of the federal income tax. Now, Mr. Griffin, how did his book help inspire your 1971 production, The Capitalist Conspiracy?
Well, I read Cleon Skousen's book, The Naked Capitalist, and of course, anybody that has read it knows right away it's just an astounding book. It was one of the first introductions I had ever had to a side of history that I guess today we would call the conspiratorial view of history, except it turned out that this was just common history. It was in the history books, but Skousen presented some facts connected with the history that were little understood. Anyway, to make a long story short, I was very impressed by the book, and so I contacted Cleon, asked him if he objected if I produced a little documentary film based on his book and giving him full credit for it and everything. And he said, no, he'd be delighted on that. So that's really how it happened. It's an outstanding book.
Amazing book. I mean, I've already ordered your book, The Creature on Jekyll Island, and his book, The Naked Capitalist, as of yesterday. I was quick to get them. I mean, I've read them, of course, but I haven't owned them yet. So I figured, hey, they're must-have for any libertarian, liberty-minded person out there, right?
Right, absolutely.
Now, Mr. Griffin, let's talk about collectivism. It is a word not taught enough in high schools or colleges across America. Today's ruling elite are, in my view, not fascists, not communists, not socialists, but collectivists. Now, can you explain collectivism to our listening audience and how some of the world's most prominent capitalists have actually helped aid communism?
Well, yeah, I think this is perhaps one of the most important topics that people could undertake in today's world because, as you just pointed out a second ago, we use these words communism, fascism, socialism, Nazism, liberalism. All these words are floating around, and we've got on the other side of the argument, supposedly we've got conservatives and we've got libertarians and we've got constitutionalists and we've got Republicans versus Democrats and all these things flowing around, and people get into heated debates based upon these words. And when you try and analyze what those words mean, it's impossible. It's like the Tower of Babel. We all have our own understandings of those words, and generally we can't agree on the definitions. And the reason for that is because they don't mean anything. The real contest, in my view, of ideologies in the modern world, at least in the Western world, is a contest between just two ideas, and those words to describe those ideas are seldom used, and we're trying to change that now. And you mentioned one of them, and that was collectivism. And the opposite of collectivism is individualism. And that's really what it's all about. And as you just said, communism, socialism, fascism, Nazism, a lot of the current definitions of Americanism even are variants of the underlying ideology that is called collectivism. And I was surprised to find out years ago when I was researching all this that word collectivism and individualism, its opposite word, were fairly common in the literature of maybe 100 years ago or 80 years ago, fairly common. And people wrote about it, everybody understood what the words meant. But by the time we got through with World War I, and we were told by our elected leaders that we had fought a war to defend democracy.
Right.
And then the word democracy started to be used as though it was, the ultimate ideal of a form of government and so forth. And even today we're using the word, we're conducting wars around the world to defend and promote democracy, we're told. Anyway, along about the time of World War I, all of the vocabulary really changed, and the word collectivism and the word individualism was pretty well scrubbed from the common dictionary. So, having said all that, what do these words mean? Well, I've been able to identify a lot of differences between individualism and collectivism, but there are five that are really the big ones. And we don't have time to go into all five of them, and I'm sure your audience doesn't want to do that anyway right now. We've done that on our website, by the way, which is Freedom Force International.
Right.
But just to give you an idea, in a general way, collectivism is the concept that government is the all-important element of society, and that the individual is the servant, that the government is the master, and the individual should serve the government because the government represents society. They like to use that word. It represents the majority. And if we're living under a so-called democracy, well, then the majority, we've been told, is the sweet spot. That's the number we want. We want 51%. If 51% of the people want something, it doesn't make any difference what it is they want. If they can muster 51% of the vote, then the winner takes all. They can do anything they want to.
Right.
That's the theory. That's the feeling today. Who wins the presidency? Who wins the election? The Democrats, the Republicans? Is it Mr. Obama? Is it Mr. Bush or whoever it is? Whoever wins, they can do anything they want because they were supported by the majority. Well, anyway, that's the theory behind collectivism, that the state, which we're told represents the majority, which represents society, is all-powerful, and the individual is secondary, should serve the state because he's serving society. He's going to be a good citizen. He's going to be a team player. These are the things that are taught in school.
Right. It's kind of like the Hegelian dialectic where the state rules supreme, and then democracy, really, what does it mean? It's mob rule, right?
Well, actually, yes. And when you really dig into it, you find out that when our founding fathers drafted the Constitution and they were creating this new structure for our state, they discussed this thing called democracy. And all of them said, democracy? Oh, we don't want a democracy. They were very specific about that.
Right.
In various ways, they said a democracy is the worst possible form of government because it always consumes itself. As soon as people find out that they can vote benefits from the public treasury, and then from that moment on, the politicians start making promises to give away other people's money so they can get the votes, and they do get the votes, and then and first thing you know, the nation is headed into economic chaos. They talked about that, and they talked about how under a democracy there was always some kind of a demagogue that arises, because democracies existed in history, a lot of them, and in every case a demagogue would arise, and he would inflame the passions of the mobs, of the masses, of the majority. He'd convince them that he was the leader and he spoke for their best interest, and then he became a dictator, became a democratic dictator. And so that's what we have in the modern world, is that we, instead of having some dictator that becomes a dictator because of force of arms, because they invaded us, now we vote for our dictators, and that's okay. We still have dictators either way, but the idea is that we voted for our dictators today, so nobody can complain. Right. Anyway, that's the general concept. Now, when you start looking at specifics, I think we ought to take a look at least at one of them. This one specific is that collectivism is based on the concept that the group is more important than the individual,
right,
and that the individual must be sacrificed if necessary for the greater good of the greater number. I was taught that in school, and it sounded like a good idea. It's, the kind of the basis of democracy. The greater good for the greater number. It's a mathematical thing. It's not a moral thing, really. It's just mathematical. The greater number should be served, and the smaller number should be sacrificed, because it's the math,
Right.
7 is greater than 5, and that's it. And most people buy into that, and I bought into it until I really started learning about this thing. And the reason it's a fallacious argument is because it's based on a trick, really. The trick is this word group. The trick is that the group exists, and in fact it does not. There's no such thing as a group. A group doesn't exist. You can't touch it. You can't see it, because it's a mathematical concept. It's an abstraction. It's a word that represents something in the mind that can be conceptualized, but it doesn't exist as a real entity. Like the word forest. Mm-hmm. You can see trees, and you can touch trees, but you cannot see a forest, and you can't touch a forest. It's an abstraction in the mind.
Wow.
And so therefore, when you say the group is more important than the individual, and the group doesn't really exist except as an abstraction, you've made a terrible, terrible mistake, because you've given some abstraction the rights and priorities that exceed something that does exist, the priority of the individual. The individual is the building block of society. And what serves the most people the best, the greater good for the greater number, what really does that is preserving the rights of the individual. That's what really is the cornerstone, or should be the cornerstone of a society. So we could go on and talk for hours just on that one thing, but that is one of the differences between individualism and collectivism, because individualists believe that the individual is the cornerstone of society, and that's what it's all about, is to preserve the rights of the individual.
That is
and a lot of the effort in a constitutional republic, which is what our founding fathers created for us, was to take measures to protect the individual from the majority. When you think about it, the Constitution was written with a Bill of Rights in the beginning, and it says Congress shall pass no law restricting the right of free speech, peaceful assembly, right to bear arms, all of these things. Congress, representing the majority, representing the people, Congress shall pass no law, meaning the majority shall pass no law. The majority shall not take away the right of free speech from the minority or a minority of one. The individual is guaranteed these things against the will of the majority in a constitutional republic, because those are considered to be intrinsic rights. These are things that people should have regardless if they're only one standing against a million. They have a right to speak, they have a right to fair trial, they have all the things that are guaranteed in the Constitution. So these are pretty heady concepts, and unfortunately, they didn't teach any of this when I went through school.
Right. Oh, you're absolutely right, Mr. Griffin, and on every topic that you covered. And you spoke of dictators earlier being elected. Now, it leads me right to my next question. Bill Clinton has admitted several times to being influenced by former Georgetown professor, historian, theorist, and elite insider Carroll Quigley. And Bill's wife is a prominent member of the unseen shadow government, which is the Council on Foreign Relations. Now, tell our listening audience of the startling revelations this friend of the international banking oligarchs, Carroll Quigley, now deceased since 1977, revealed in his book, Tragedy and Hope, where he unveils that the global power elite have bought political influence for more than 200 years and counting. Now, he also coined the phrase, now I'm going to read one of his quotes here, the argument that the two parties should represent opposed ideals and policies, one perhaps of the right and the other of the left, is a foolish idea, acceptable only to the doctrine and academic thinkers. Instead, the two parties should be almost identical so that the American people can throw the rascals out and at any election without leading to any profound or extreme shifts in policy. Your thoughts, Mr. Griffin?
Well, yeah, that really is perhaps one of the most important revelations that Quigley ever made, in my view.
Right.
But I think we ought to back up a little bit and go over what you just said, so that maybe your audience is already aware of this, but right. I think this is so important. Let's go back over it, if we may.
Okay.
Quigley, as you said, he's deceased now, but he was a well-known, respected professor at Georgetown University, mm-hmm. and history professor, and Bill Clinton was one of his students, and it's clear that Quigley took Clinton under his wing, and it was largely because of Quigley, I think, that Clinton received the Rhodes Scholarship, and that was sort of the door that opened up for him and brought him into prominence in global politics, certainly in the United States. But the thing about Quigley is not just that he was a professor, or that he wrote a book called Tragedy and Hope, and that he wrote another book, I think it was called the
Anglo-American Establishment.
The Anglo-American Establishment, which was sort of covered the same topic. But the important thing is what those books were about. Those books were the sort of the unofficial history of the greatest conspiracy that has ever been conceived and implemented on this planet. A conspiracy which Professor Quigley said was responsible for most of the major events in the world since around World War I forward, and Quigley said, and it's very active today. So this is kind of a startler when you think of that. Here's a secret society, actually, is what he was talking about, and it was created by Cecil Rhodes, the founder of the Rhodes Scholarships, and that Cecil Rhodes, of course, who was one of the wealthiest men in the world at the turn of the last century, because he had control of all of the diamond mines of South Africa, he was the founder of the De Beers Diamond Company and so forth, one of the wealthiest men in the world. What people don't realize is that when he died, he left his vast estate to fund a secret society, and that some of the most prominent men in England, including Lord Rothschild, were part of that secret society. Rothschild was considered to be the unofficial banker of this group, and there were people with nobility all up and down in England, many of them having high-ranking positions in the British government, who became the original group, and that this group set about to conquer the world in accordance with Cecil Rhodes' formula. His formula was that our group, he said, should conquer the world quietly, not with bullets and bayonets and bombs, but we should make sure that members of our secret society infiltrate into all of the power centers of society, that they go into government, they go into media, they go into the universities and the school systems, labor unions, every important aspect of life. He said our members should dominate so that we can lead the masses according to the ideas which we will establish, and people will never know that they're being led. And this is Cecil Rhodes now. And how do we know this? Is because, well, first of all, Cecil Rhodes himself actually wrote about much of this, and notes in his own handwriting can be found in the British Library, Library of London, in his own handwriting. And but also we know, because of others involved had spoken about it, there was a man by the name of William Stead, or Steed. I've never figured out how he pronounced his name. But William was the executor of Cecil Rhodes' estate, and he implemented his wills, and he wrote a book on this thing called The Wills of Cecil Rhodes. And if you get hold of a copy of that book, and he talks about what Cecil Rhodes was trying to do. So much of it was hidden, but some of it was made public, and the part that was made public was quite enough to put it all together. And to make a long and interesting story a little shorter, is that Professor Quigley wrote about all of this, and that was the essence of his books. And then he details how this secret society was able to replicate itself in all of the countries that were the former British dependencies, Australia, right, Canada, and so forth, and the United States. Except in the United States, they had a little different challenge. In all of the other countries, they called this group let me see, I have to stop and think for a second. It's the Royal Institute for International Affairs.
Right.
But in the United States, instead of calling it that, they called it the Council on Foreign Relations.
Right. Because
they figured the American people wouldn't be too keen on the word royal. The other countries were no problem because they had their queen, but the Americans didn't want a queen or a king, so they changed the name to Council on Foreign Relations. And it turns out that this Council on Foreign Relations and all of these royal institutes are merely parts of a secret society, and that they are implementing a plan to take over the world piece by piece, quietly, by dominating the power centers of the nations which it controls. And it turns out then, finally, to put the last piece of the puzzle together, is that the members of the Council on Foreign Relations in the United States, which now represent about 4,000 members, a little bit more than that now, a small number compared to the national population, they actually are the hidden government of the United States. They mean, when you look at the list of the presidents and the secretaries of state and the heads of the CIA and the FBI, right, Supreme Court justices, senators, congressmen, all the people that are running the show, heads of the major news networks, ABC, CBS, NBC, Ted Turner, all of these. Just look all up and what are the organizations that lead America, and look at the heads of those organizations. You will find that, I'm going to put this number out of thin air now, but it's close at least. You're going to find that about 80 to 85% of them are thoroughly dominated by members of the Council on Foreign Relations.
Wow.
Now, what does that mean? That means that the nation has gradually fallen into the hands of a secret society that was created by Cecil Rhodes. And now we go back and we say, what again was the goal of that secret society? Well, the goal was to dominate the world, to create what they now call a new world order. But the kicker is, what kind of a new world order? I mean, who cares whether it's a new world order if it's a good one? The kind of the new world order is it's got to be based on the model of collectivism. And right, that's, well, we made the complete circle, and we're back to that word again. So what these guys are creating is a global dictatorship. with all power at the top in the hands of the government leaders and those people behind the scenes that control the government leaders, and you and I and everybody else in the population were just to be pawns in the game.
Unbelievable. Unbelievable. Mr. Griffin, you started your illustrious career as a child actor, I believe, and worked at a couple of radio stations before the age of 20, them being CBS and NBC affiliates. Tell our listening audience what some of your fondest memories are from radio and acting.
Okay, what a leap that will be from the serious topic we just
right.
Yeah, probably your audience is ready for that. Well, yeah, that takes me back many, many moons. You're right, and when I was a kid, I got involved in radio in Detroit. It's a long story, but radio was the big thing in those days. And let's see, what years were those? Those were about 1942, 43, 44, around in there. And they announced in the Detroit school system that they were going to have a radio workshop on Saturdays. And any of the kids in the whole Detroit system that cared about learning how to speak into a microphone, for example, and that was a big deal. I mean, not too many microphones around in those days. Speak into a microphone and how to act and visit a radio studio and look behind the scenes, all that sort of thing. Boy, I was right there. I took the bus, 3 buses actually, to get there on Saturday. When I got there, went to this big studio that this system had built up on the top of one of their administrative buildings. There must have been 800 kids there. Man, there was not even a place to sit on the floor. We had to stand. Well, they showed us a microphone, and they told us what radio was, and that there was a control room, and there was a director, and he threw finger signals at you, and when you got the signal, you had to speak, and you shouldn't get too close to the microphone. The distance should be about 10 inches, and the whole thing. Boy, we were lapping that stuff up. Well, the next week they had another session, but when I got there, the 800 had dropped to about 500, and the next week it dropped to about 300, and the next week it was dropped to about 100, and finally, by the end of the season, there were 12 of us. We just stuck with it,
Right.
So anytime any of the radio stations in the Detroit area wanted some little kid to read a line or two, they'd call on that little pool. So I started getting calls to appear on programs like, The Lone Ranger.
Wow. Came
out of Detroit, yeah. The Hermit's Cave, it was a ghost story type of thing, came out of there.
Very cool.
We had a lot of programs, and so I got to do a lot of that at a very early age. I enjoyed it, and if you hear those old Lone Ranger programs and you hear some kids say, "Gosh, Dad, here come the Indians," that might have been me, and so anyway, when I got to be a teenager, I auditioned for a program came out of that was CBS called Make Way for Youth, and it was a musical program primarily. They had a teenage choir and an orchestra, and it was broadcast every Saturday morning over the CBS network. Make Way for Youth, and I was the the teenage master of ceremonies, Eddie Griffin. I hated Eddie, but that's what they wanted to call me, Eddie. So I read script for that for a summer or two, and then when I went to school, University of Michigan, I got a job at the university radio station as a staff announcer. That's how I earned my extra money at school, and by this time I'm getting through college. I take on responsibility of marriage, marry a beautiful girl who was a student nurse there, still my wife many years later.
Very nice.
And then I go to work for WWJ, which is an NBC affiliate in Detroit. It was WWJ TV, so that was a big deal because TV was just coming into its own at that time. And I was technically called an assistant director, but that makes it sound too important. Actually, I was a floor manager, which means I was the guy on the floor of the studio with the earphones on, taking orders from the director, who was up in the booth, and
Right.
throwing cues to the various actors and flipping signs that they had to, shoot with the camera,
Right.
and dragging cables and all that stuff. So that's it. That was my early days, and that's how I cut my teeth.
Nice. I definitely identify with you, Mr. Griffin. I mean, in high school, I was the gaffer for a couple of productions, so I mean, I got to see, the film productions aspect, and and then in high school, I also came across your film, The Capitalist Conspiracy. So, I mean, from a young age, I've been wanting to do radio, and I've wanted to, kind of mirror your footsteps in a way.
Well, you're on your way.
Thank you, Mr.
Welcome.
Thank you so much. Now, tell us about your time as a writer for George Wallace, actually his vice presidential candidate. Sorry, Curtis LeMay in 1968, who I believe ran on the American Independent Party as a paleo-conservative. And tell us also about your critique of the United Nations in one of your first illustrations titled The Fearful Master, which makes it clear that the United Nations is plotting to destroy not just American sovereignty, but the sovereignty of every nation on Earth.
Yeah, that's probably a far more important topic than my experiences with Curtis LeMay, but it's a little eddy current in my life. When George Wallace and LeMay ran for, Wallace was running for president and LeMay as vice president, I wasn't particularly enthralled by either of them as being great leaders or anything, but I saw them as a challenge to the old corrupt two-party system.
Right.
And by this time I knew that there wasn't being a difference between Republicans and Democrats. It was just showmanship. That was very clear to me. And so when I saw a lot of support for this candidacy of Wallace and LeMay, I thought, well, here's a chance to crack that open at least. So I got very involved with their campaign, and somebody asked me if I would like to go to work for the campaign as a speechwriter for LeMay, and they offered me a pretty attractive salary for that period of a few months. And I thought about it, and I talked to my wife about it, and I called him back. I said, yes, I'll do it, but I don't want the money. I don't really want the money. I think that I'm going to do this because I believe in it, and I want to be pure about this. And so I want to write what I want to write and what I really think, and I don't want to do it for a paycheck. So I said, I'll take $1. And they agreed to pay me $1, and the dirty guys never gave me my $1. Can you imagine that?
Oh, man.
So I did. Yeah. But anyway, so I took the job, and first thing you know, I got a taste of what that's all about. I've never thought much about it, but boy, all the Secret Service men and the airplanes and the traveling in motorcades and all that sort of thing.
Right.
I was in the middle of that for a little while, and so I met the general, went over to his house, and had dinner there. A very impressive man, and his wife was very impressive lady, very well informed, very dynamic people. And so I thought, boy, this is really quite an experience. And so I started to write speeches for him. We talked about what it is that he wanted to say and what it is that I thought would be good to say, and we came to a meeting of the minds, and we agreed that we would talk about the size and scope of government, and we should talk about foreign policy in terms of being defensive and not aggressive. Pretty much the same things that I still advocate today. Right. And so I wrote a couple of speeches for the general, and we traveled around, and lo and behold, the general never gave any of the speeches. Not because he didn't want to; he liked the speeches actually, but every time he got in front of a group of reporters or any other public appearance, the reporters would show up, and of course the press was very hostile to him. They did not want him or George Wallace to to receive favorable publicity,
Of course.
and they were looking for ways to discredit both of them. I wasn't involved on the Wallace side, but I saw it spill over, because the minute the general would stand up, before he could say more than 3 or 4 words, some reporter would stand up in the audience and say, "Is it true, General, that you're a racist?" or something like that. Because Wallace came from the South, and the media was trying to, paint him as a racist.
Right.
To tell you the truth, I don't know whether he was or not. I don't think he was. But anyway, they were trying to paint him as a racist, and all I knew is that the general had a very short temper. His fuse was very, very short, and all they'd have to do is just egg him on with a couple of questions like that, and he would forget his script and launch into a tirade or a defense against these charges that were being thrown at him, bing, 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 like this. And he never did get to any of my speeches. And he would rant and rave, and so I gave up. I said, "Well, General, I'm going to leave these speeches with you here, and if you get tired of giving these and you want some more, give me a call." And so I dropped out of it. That's what happened there.
That's great. I could kind of sympathize with the general there sometimes. I mean, you get kind of heated at some of these reporters, right?
Oh yeah, and he really, he was used to being in command, and he just didn't know how to handle that kind of heckling. It's strange to him, and he wasn't a public speaker. He didn't know anything about debate. He didn't know about trying to keep decorum, whether you were angry or not, all that sort of thing. So he always stepped into their traps.
Wow.
So anyway, your next question probably was the most important one, which was about the United Nations. What's that all about?
Right. Well, your book, The Fearful Master, right? One of your first illustrations.
The Fearful Master, A Second Look at the United Nations, was in fact my first book. And I consider it to this day to be one of the most important things I've ever done, if not the most important. Because the UN, I think people are beginning to realize this by now, but the UN is really designed to be the embodiment of this new world order based on the model of collectivism. That's what it is. It was sold in the beginning, and I bought it hook, line, and sinker in those days. I was a young guy. It was sold as our last best hope for peace. We've just been through a couple of wars, and they were devastating wars, and we were told that if we didn't get together in peace and harmony and brotherhood, we were going to blow up the planet. We were going to destroy all life on Earth. And therefore, this was our last best hope for peace. Not only that, it was a chance to build harmony and brotherhood and improve commerce between nations, lower the cultural and religious barriers, and eliminate the hatred. And then they threw in the business about we're going to make everybody healthy too. We're going to inoculate all these poor children in Africa against the dread diseases of yaws and all these different things. And everywhere you looked, you got all this good stuff, hearing about this good stuff that the United Nations was designed to do. And so most people just jumped right on the bandwagon. And when I began to get wind of the fact that most of this was fraud, that it was bait, it was like a spider saying, "Come into my parlor," And I thought, wait a minute, these guys aren't really sincere at all.
Right.
This is a trick. Once I got that, I started to look for evidence, and it was everywhere, but I didn't see it because I didn't want to see it, for one thing. Anyway, then I decided to give some speeches on this topic, and I began to talk about the things I'd learned, the things I dug up, the quotations, the statements from the people themselves that were perpetrating this fraud, and the speeches were well received, and people suggested I write a book about it. So I did. I sort of took some time off, and I that was my first book, actually, and I really didn't think I could write, to tell you the truth, Bruce.
Wow.
I always thought of myself as a speaker.
Right.
Well, I've been through radio and acting and all that sort of thing. I'm a communicator, but I work from the stage, thank you. Exactly. I don't write, but anyway, I had to write. So I was amazed to find out that I enjoyed it. It's another lesson, I suppose, for any young people listening to this, that if you think you can't do something, don't be so sure. Maybe you do have a talent for it if you really buckle down and give it a try. So anyway, I wrote the book, and it was an expose of the United Nations at that time. Of course, the UN has advanced far, far down the road from that point, but everything I laid out in that book has been implemented. All the predictions I made that, what the United Nations would become, what it would do, right, why it was formed, that's all come to pass. Right. So basically, the United Nations is the embodiment of collectivism on a worldwide scale. So if you like fascism, communism, or Nazism, you're going to love the United Nations.
No, that's incredible, Mr. Griffin. I mean, really what they are is the continuation of the League of Nations, right? I mean, how can one expect freedom or liberty to come from a communist or Marxist think tank like the UN? I mean, it's just absurd to me, right?
Well, yes, it is absurd and even if you didn't have that factor, you realize that the member nations at the UN, by far, the vast majority of them are little tin-horn dictatorships or exactly, massive dictatorships. And how do you expect anything to come out of that? The common denominator is dictatorship. How do you expect those people to build something that is that they themselves do not have?
It's completely absurd. Now, moving on, Mr. Griffin, I've interviewed some of the world's top authorities regarding cancer, and you were right up there. Now, Mr. Griffin, you wrote a book titled World Without Cancer, The Story of Vitamin B17. Now, give our listening audience the inside scoop regarding the story of vitamin B17, which I believe is also known as amygdalin. Hope I said that right, a chemical compound.
I think they call it amygdalin.
Amygdalin, oh my God.
Yeah.
Oh my God. Amygdalin, thank you. That's why you're the man. It's a chemical compound that is isolated from seeds, I believe. Right?
Yeah, that's one source. Amygdalin comes from about 1,400 edible plants. Seeds are a very important category, but it also comes from grasses and a lot of green things. It's found in nature. It's ubiquitous. And the reason, I believe, after having done this research, is that it's part of nature's balance. It's nature's control for cancer. So now I take off my ideological hat and I put on my health hat, and to tell you that I didn't expect to get into that field either, and I wouldn't have been in it except for the fact that a very good friend of mine in the political field was an MD, a doctor in San Francisco. His name was John Richardson, and he had a family practice there. And he started to use amygdalin in the treatment of his cancer patients, and much to his surprise, he was getting excellent results, far better than any results he had received previously using orthodox therapies of, radiation, chemotherapy, or even surgery. And here was this little simple substance that came from nature. It was cheap, and it was working. And, of course, then he ran afoul of the medical authorities that said, Doctor, we don't care whether this works or not. It's not approved by the FDA, and the law says that you cannot use an unapproved substance. And so that's when John called me, and he said, Ed, I don't know what to do about this. He said, this stuff is saving lives, and they're going to take my license from me if I don't stop saving lives. He said, this is insane. Right. I agreed with him. And so the reason he called me, he said, look, I'm a doctor. I treat patients. You're a writer. Would you help me write a magazine article explaining how we think this works and explain the results we're getting and get these people off my back? And I said, well, sure, John, that sounds like it would be fun. It would be important to do, too. So I jumped on the project thinking it would be about a 3 or 4 or 5 week project, not realizing the tremendous scope. I didn't realize the high voltage that was in those wires I was about to touch.
Right.
And so anyway, that's how it all started, and it took me several years to get through all of that. interviewing the people who really were scientists. I had no background for that. I had to start from ground zero and learn everything from the ground up. It was like going back to school. But I did have a lot of very good help from people who were scientists and practicing physicians and theoreticians and chemists and so forth. So anyway, the make the short of it is that we put together the story, and the story is that cancer really is not caused by something. It's caused by the lack of something, and that lack of something is a food component, a food factor.
Right.
And in primitive diets, in primitive societies, you seldom find cancer. Only in modern advanced societies. And one of the differences between a primitive society and a so-called advanced society is their diet. In the advanced societies, they have refined foods. They have selected foods. In the primitive societies, they can't afford the luxury of all those nice-tasting foods. They eat things that are a little bit bitter. And that bitter taste, it turns out, is associated with this amygdalin. You find it in the seeds, primarily in seeds of peaches or apricots or apple seeds, things like that. You can find it in grasses. Who eats this stuff? Well, primitive people do. Right. But in modern society, you don't. And to make a long story, it's finally a little bit shorter, is that this substance works in the control of cancer because it is toxic to cancer cells, but not toxic to normal cells.
Wow. Amazing stuff. Now, Mr. Griffin, before we run out of time, I definitely want to touch up on a couple of more important topics with you. Going back to the Federal Reserve. Now, it is my belief that the Federal Reserve played a pivotal part, not just in President Kennedy's murder, but in Abraham Lincoln's, James Garfield, William McKinley's deaths as well. All presidents were against a Rothschild-owned central bank in America, truly adding truth to the statement that banking institutions are more dangerous than standing armies. Now, I believe Andrew Jackson was one of the only survivors of an attempted assassination attempt. But, Mr. Griffin, the Fed definitely killed President Kennedy, I believe, due to his backing of silver coinage, which is Executive Order 11110, which would have been the first official audit of the private-owned Federal Reserve Bank, basically the Department of Treasury's partner in crime, this centralized monster that promotes devalued currency and inflation. Being a certified financial planner, Mr. Griffin, you literally wrote the book on the Fed. Tell us about your book, The Creature from Jekyll Island.
Well, I'd be happy to do that, but I have to back up a second, and although I hate to do this, I have to say I disagree with that conclusion about the Kennedy assassination.
Okay.
I put a couple of paragraphs to that effect in my book toward the end. I called it the myth of the JFK, or the JFK myth regarding his assassination. My reading of the facts does not support that point of view. And I put some of the reasons in the book, but anybody that wants to explore this, at least my analysis of it, I urge them to come to our Freedom Force website. Right. That's freedomforceinternational.org, and look up the issues section. There's a bunch of drop-down menus there, and one of them is the issues, and then they'll navigate over to a little icon that says Money and Banking. And if you click on that, you can finally drill down to a little article that I wrote some time ago about the JFK assassination. Right. I've looked at that, all of those details quite carefully, and I cannot come to the same conclusion. First of all, we have to understand that Kennedy, no matter how popular he was and how right he was about many things, still was an internationalist. He was in favor of the Fed. He was in favor of a new world order based on the model of collectivism. He was trained at the Fabian University in London, the London School of Economics, which was funded by the Fabian socialists. He was imbued with all of that.
Wow.
And he had no evidence of anything in his background of turning against the international bankers. But anyway, that's another story. I certainly agree with everything else. But if you're interested in my analysis, please look that up. So now, how I got into the book, well, I won't give you all the details on that either, except that it was like everything else in my life, and probably yours too. You never expect things to turn out the way they do. You start down one path, and the first thing you know, the wind blows, and it blows you over to another path, and there you go. So I never expected to write a book on the Federal Reserve. I wanted to produce a little documentary film some years ago about inflation. Never did produce that film, but one thing led to another, and I acquired a lot of research. And again, people asked me to put the information into a speech, and then I did, and they liked the speech, and then they said, why don't you write a book about it? So I did, and it took me about at least 7 years to do that. And I learned so much on that journey, Bruce, I cannot tell you. I had no idea how ignorant I was about money when I started on that path. And anyway, once I got into it and I realized that this was not just a boring topic of money and banking, it wasn't just a bunch of formulas and definitions of accounting terminology. This was a whodunit. I discovered this is one of the greatest whodunits of history, one of the greatest crimes of history. And to make matters even more interesting, I discovered who did it and how they did it.
Right.
And where they buried the body, and and so I just was all of a sudden compelled to stop everything and devote at that time my total energies, my total life to learning everything that there was to learn about this crime, and to write it in such a fashion that it wasn't a textbook on money and banking, but that it was the unraveling of a mystery. And that's how I tried, and that's how I saw it in real life, and that's how I tried to write it.
Amazing. Now, real quick, we're wrapping up here. Mr. Griffin, I find it ironic that Obama acts like a military man when he has never served in the Army a day in his life. Now, you being a former sergeant in the Army, do you believe that congressmen that vote to go to war should send their firstborn sons to combat? Good one, right?
Oh, well, there's a certain righteousness to that, isn't there? How can you say no? But I think that the issue is bigger than that, really.
Right.
Because some of these congressmen may actually be willing to send their firstborn to war. Right. That doesn't mean I want them to send my firstborn to war. So the issue is a little bit bigger than that. It's why do we have wars in the first place? Wars, by the way, I'm not a total pacifist. I believe that you have to fight to defend yourself.
Right.
But if it's defensive, everybody wants to defend themselves and their family and their community and their nation. But to be an aggressive fighter, to say, who am I going to conquer today? Who am I going to decide? I don't like their style of government. I think my style of government is better, and I'm going to go in and kill anybody over there that gets in my way so that they can have my style of government. Now that I don't agree with that. Whether it's firstborn or not sent in, it's just wrong.
Right. Definitely is. Now, Mr. Griffin, unfortunately, we're out of time. I've been on cloud 9 throughout this entire broadcast. I literally have about 12 or 15 more questions I could ask you, but I didn't pay the extra 100 for the other hour. Now, Mr. Griffin, I want to thank you so much for being on. Thank you so much. And let our listeners know where they can find you.
Okay, well, our commercial site where you can buy books and things is called Reality Zone. Easy to remember. It's realityzone.com. We have about 100 different items there. Books, recordings, videotapes, and all that sort of thing. But our think tank website, for people who want to analyze the ideology and to formulate a plan of action to change the world, you'll find all that on another website. It's called freedomforceinternational.org. freedomforceinternational.org. And be prepared to spend some time and burn some brain cells on that site.
Thank you so much, Mr. Griffin, for being on. I definitely have to schedule you again sometime in the near future. Thank you.
All right. Okay, Bruce, and keep it up. I appreciate what you're doing. Thank you.
Thank you, Ed. Thank you so much.